I'll just say a few words about Rachel because it's been a privilege to work with Rachel over the years. And I think you come from the ITU background, Rachel, so you really understand about that critically ill patient. And I think, we mustn't lose sight of the patient at the heart of everything we're doing. But I think not only have you been a patient advocate, but I think you've also been an advocate for nursing evolving a new role within the transfusion team. And in particular, I think the most exciting work we did together towards the end was actually how your team can add extra value to the major incidents involving number of casualties. And we've heard comments about sample handling and communicating, and you have been so important to the development. So the floor is yours, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Heidi. Thank you all for inviting me to speak today. I'm very aware I'm the last speaker, and I'll hopefully get this because I'm sure there's lots of questions for everybody else. So yes, I'm Rachel Moss, a transfusion practitioner at Great Ormond Street Hospital. Not a place well known for its major incident work, I'll grant you, but I have worked at Imperial College Hospital in London for a long time before that, so was seriously involved in quite a few before then. And for those who work in a clinical scene and know about transfusion practitioners, we don't work 24 hours a day, which means that we're not actually part of the transfusion process when it comes to a major incident, because I have to say my days of 24-hour working and nights and weekends are long gone. But we definitely have a part to play because the transfusion team is what underpins the work of a transfusion laboratory. Next slide, please. So what is a transfusion practitioner? Now, I would imagine that most people do know, but we go under a number of different names. The most common name is transfusion nurse specialist, or it could be a transfusion safety officer. It could be, if you're in Northern Ireland, a hemovigilance officer. If you're in the United States of America, it's a transfusion safety officer. So there are a number of titles, but what we do is sit there in the middle of the transfusion team on a day-to-day basis, managing various parts of the transfusion process. Next slide, please. And I use this slide in all my talks because I think it's a beautiful way of illustrating what we do, both within the internal relationships in a hospital and our external relationships. And there may well be some of you on this call that could put your name instead of transfusion practitioner because you too have some very similar relationships. And when you look at this, this is my day-to-day job. This is me worrying about blood transfusion in normal times. Next slide, please. But when you put this to a major incident, you'll see that actually much of it is also really applicable because all the things that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, those relationships are then intensified when things go, take a little turn that they do under a major incident. So where does the TP sit in all this? Next slide, please. Well, one of the things that we do as transfusion practitioners, we use the term hemovigilance. And there are risks. Now, let me start this by saying that what we do in a transfusion, in a major incident, as one who has lived through it with a clinical hat on, as well as a transfusion practitioner hat, is amazing. And 99% of what we do is absolutely brilliant. And that's, when we're thinking about safety too, what we do well, celebrating success, absolutely. But, none of us come to work to make mistakes, and those of us at the head end of a patient are not focusing on the transfusion risks because there are 1,000 other risks at the same time. But they are there nonetheless. We know we get sample errors. We know we've got multiple casualties with unknown names. We have had wrong blood in tube events happening in major incidents. We have had risks with single cross-matching where normally we would have a second sample. We know patients move around and blood is trying to chase it around. There's then a risk of it being out of temperature. Updating computers because patients want their real name when actually all our blood is issued on an old name. Ensuring that we've got things like adult males, ensuring O positive blood and platelets. Julie's also alluded to A platelets. And also thinking about blood wastage. And this is my job on a day-to-day basis. I'm looking at these things every day. So being in a major incident isn't going to change that. Next slide, please. So where do I sit in the role in major incident planning? Well, when you're planning for these things, it involves a coordinated approach. We know that. We do this in the cold light of day when things aren't going wrong. And so the TP can really be at the beginning of this, looking at where these roles and responsibilities lie and where they can feed in. We've got expert knowledge on all the things you don't need to worry about, because that's why they employ me. I know about the transfusion chain. I know about the safe administration. I know about sample taking safely. And all those things, the patient still deserves a safe transfusion experience, even if we're trying to save their life at the same time. And the whole planning, implementation, education, making sure people know what to do, it's there, crucial. And I work so closely with the laboratory that I'm sort of joined at the hip with them, and we are very interchangeable, but I am out there and I am there clinically, and I can impart that knowledge. So ensuring that people understand to do things well. And also, Julie's just shown you what's going on in the lab. I understand what's going on in the lab. So not only can I go to the lab and go, this is what's happening, this is what they're trying to do in the clinical area, I can go back to the clinical area and go, this is what's happening in the lab. We've already alluded to the fact babies don't stop being born, even if the whole of the hospital's on a major incident alert. Next slide, please. Now, shameless plug. I can only apologise, but I'm shamelessly plugging it anyway. I'm very involved in the International Blood Transfusion Society. And just to show that this is not just a UK-based thing, this is a paper that I wrote a few years ago with colleagues from Belgium, from the Netherlands, and from Australia, absolutely looking at what a transfusion practitioner can do in the disaster planning. So we know that there is a role for this to make sure that we're involved right from the beginning and all the way through, but not just in the UK, outside of the UK. And this really adds to our joined up thinking around the world of where the TP role sits in major incidents. Next slide, please. So what can a TP really do? It has to run without me. You know, if it's a Sunday afternoon, I'm not there. It's as simple as that. Now, it may well be that I am there because it's a Monday afternoon. Great. But I might be a TP who's by background a biomedical scientist. I've never been near a patient who's bleeding out. So it doesn't mean that I'm going to be involved as a transfusion practitioner. But what we've seen, and this was particularly in London 7/7, where I was involved, and we know this happened from the Manchester Arena bombings, that the transfusion practitioner happened to be on site and therefore stepped into a really crucial coordinator role where they did just that. They could talk to the lab about what was happening with the patient, and then they could talk to the patient's end, or the clinical staff, about what was happening in the lab. And everybody fed back about what benefits that had. And actually, we've also seen it's become much more informal, that it was just happening. Next slide, please. So with the help of Heidi and Fats and others in the team, we decided to set up a transfusion coordinator action card. So this is really sitting under the umbrella of the National Blood Transfusion Committee and the Emergency Planning Working Group. And so I'm going to go into a little bit more detail, but we really hope that what we've developed can be brought into all hospitals so that we can have that conduit. If I'm doing that in real life, if I'm a conduit between the clinical teams and the lab, and I'm there and I'm understanding both sides, then why can't we do this at this crucial time? Next slide, please. So it's an aid memoir. We've put it as a single page. We've already said that too many words just confuses the day. So we want it to be really straightforward. And the idea is that put it where your packs are, where your major incident cards are, anywhere it can be found. And it's also available, as you can see on the link, on the Transfusion Guidelines website under the Transfusion Committee and the working group. So please do have a look at it. Next slide, please. Now, I've already said that transfusion practitioners aren't there all the time. So the first thing we thought about is who could do this? Well, you know, it could be anybody who is likely to be in the hospital. So it could be a transfusion practitioner or a patient blood management practitioner. It could be a biomedical scientist who feels comfortable to be between the two areas. It could easily be a hematology SBR. It could be an ED SBR. We thought it could be a clinical site practitioner. So it's somebody who feels comfortable going between the two areas. We know that we have a bronze command, and then there'll also be some laboratory bronze command. So it's that understanding both sides of the situation. You are coordinating timely, safe transfusion support to the clinical teams by ensuring that the lab know what's going on and the clinical teams understand the laboratory's processes. Next slide, please. So the incident is called, and this is where your coordinator really starts their role, because they can feed back. Now, we know there are multiple ways of information getting around a hospital at times like this, but there are always also pockets where information isn't given. And because this is a liaison role and it's a visible role, you are there, you are in the ED, but you can shoot back to the laboratory really quickly. And so people get to see you and go, ah, that's the person who I need to talk to about blood transfusion. So you're there, you're on standby. Everybody goes, right, there's a transfusion practitioner or there's a transfusion coordinator. Again, really being that conduit of information and keeping the laboratory informed. They may have been told as a major incident, but they sometimes don't know whether whether they're being flooded in ED or whether we're all stood there and 2 patients have come through the door. Next slide, please. And so what we did during 7/7, and others did the same, so this is where we thought of this, is a blood station. Now, there may well be blood fridges in your ED, but in some of the smaller EDs, they may not have a blood fridge. But you can have a blood station, which just basically means somebody's manning a blood fridge. But it just means that if we're taking blood out, it's not left lying around. We can see where it's been going. We can help with the sample labeling. We can see how much blood is being given and given a heads up to the lab straight away. And even if you've got the setting where your laboratory can see blood being scanned in and out, these are very different circumstances. We keep the communication channels going, and if somebody knows you're there, they can ask for your help. So if I've issued a bag of ONEG, I can write down that went to Rachel Moss, and then somebody says, Rachel doesn't need it now, I'm going to issue it to Julie Staves. I can keep on top of that and see where it's going, because this flying squad blood is not labelled for patients, and we need to keep it so we know where it's going. Not your responsibility. If you're working at the clinical end, you've got 1,000 things, but in the lab, we have to know these things. Next slide, please. And then stand down. So I just sort of alluded to where blood goes. If you are not in blood transfusion, it is not even on your radar, and it shouldn't need to be. But for those of us who work in transfusion medicine, we need to know by law where blood goes. Not a priority for some, but it has to be for us. We need to know that the blood we transfused was safe and it hadn't been sat on a radiator for 4 hours. We need to know that everything that was done, and if mistakes happened, we could pick them up and learn from them. Julie mentioned debriefs. Rather like Julie said, if somebody's as a transfusion practitioner never got invited, just turn up anyway. They're never going to send you home. And so we follow up on the stuff which isn't critical to patient surviving, but is actually very important to what we need to do on a day-to-day basis. And we want it to run well next time. We want it to do well. Every time I've been involved in a major incident, and as Heidi said, I was an ICU sister at St Mary's for many years, we learned from it. So when the next one came, we knew what we'd picked up, and it's exactly the same in transfusion. Next slide, please. And then we go back to business as usual. And I thought I'd throw in a blood stock slide for the last few months, because blood doesn't grow on trees. We have been in a national blood shortage within the last 2 years. And that's not to say that if we needed it in a major incident, it wouldn't all be ready to go immediately. But we still have to find it and use it and make sure we don't lose it. So we know that we will continue to issue blood long after stand down. And Julie mentioned that sometimes up to 48 hours, we're still issuing blood for theatre. There's a push for us to get back to elective surgery as soon as possible, and we also need to make sure we have enough blood for that. So blood stocks is a huge driving force, making sure you've got blood when you need it. And the clinical end, nobody wants to wait for it. It's a sickening feeling when you can't get hold of blood and you need it. I've done it. I've been there. But on the flip side, we don't want bags hanging around just in case. We've already talked about how to use ONEG and A platelets and A plasma, and that is so crucial, and again can be brought into a debrief, and looking at activity for the next week. Next slide, please. Now, this is an interesting one, because if you are in a major incident, whatever the cause, and you need a blood transfusion and it will save your life, then nobody really is going to start talking about blood transfusion consent. patient may not even be in a position to consent. And there is no currently formal consent for blood in the United Kingdom. In an elective situation, we expect that discussion. But I think, and we believe in transfusion, that there is still a place for that post-traumatic event conversation, if only because, for all we know, our patient may well have been an avid blood donor and they can no longer be a blood donor. And that actually may be a conversation that we need to have with them. They may be concerned about risks of transfusion. And of course, that conversation couldn't be held. And we can go back and talk to them about that. So don't underestimate a post-transfusion discussion with the patient. And again, you have a transfusion practitioner and a transfusion team that can either do it or at least support that. So not only making sure that we give the blood for the right reasons, but making sure the patient understood why we had to transfuse them. Most patients, I'm sure, would be delighted they were transfused to save their life, but not all patients are most patients, and we need to remember that. Next slide, please. And we've already talked about the lab, and Julie has said absolutely admirably, we look after our lab staff, and I sincerely hope everybody who's involved in the lab do. But I think it's worth remembering, particularly if we've got a junior biomedical scientist on, and this is out of hours, that this is very new to them. And they don't always fully understand, A, what's going on, and B, they're very traumatic. Having worked now as a transfusion practitioner for 21 years and seen junior BMSs, they do need, as all do nurses and junior doctors, lots of help and support. And they'll often come to me with my nursing background to talk through what happened and why, even at Great Ormond Street, where we have children, may not be a major incident, but it may well be an event that was unexpected and traumatic for the patient, ergo traumatic sometimes for the scientists. Human factors is a critical part of what we do, but also human healthcare, looking after each other, making sure that everybody on the team is involved. And if your baby biomedical scientist wants to come to the debrief, then do you know what? I bring them with them and let them come and listen. So everybody is part of this. I think we're much better than we were 20 years ago at including the laboratory. I think 20 years ago, they were seen as a silent partner behind a door. I do hope that in the 21 years I've been doing this job, we've now brought them out into the sunshine, blinking out of the lab to realise that we're all in this together. We can't run a major incident without a transfusion laboratory. And so they are just as crucial as everybody else when we're looking at what we did and how we did it, how well we did, and things we can improve for future. Next slide, please. So I've brought us in quite short soon because I'm very aware that several hours on Teams gives people googly eyes. But just to say that your transfusion practitioner is crucial to planning the blood management in a major incident. All the people who you've heard speak today all brought their expertise and their knowledge, and without which you couldn't run a major incident. But I really hope that although the transfusion practitioner isn't there at the head end, by getting a coordinator role in place, by supporting that, by educating that, by being part of the planning, by being part of the debrief, by being part of the business as usual afterwards, that it keeps that seamless connection between clinical and laboratory, which is really underpins everything we do as transfusion practitioners. Thank you very much for listening.
Rachel, that was fantastic. And I think it just gives people just a glimpse into some of the things that you've contributed to both British and international transfusion. And I think having that really holistic approach and speaking up for others has been so important. So I don't think you have any Vivox slides.
No, I didn't have the bandwidth for that to have to do a TP
No,
day
to
and
tell you
today.
the truth, yeah, bandwidth today, running the two conferences. I'm going to speak to these slides, and then it might be that the others of the team want to comment as well. So quite a lot of the questions that have come up on chat and Q&A is about resources, because what I want is for people to go away from today being able to have some new ideas, but take something really concrete. And so FATS has put up the clinical guidelines, and this seems strange, but I remember helping develop this, and this is bringing together the military experience as well as civilian experience from the extraordinary events that had taken place. And we've had Martin, Alistair and Sadie talk about these tragedies. But it was clear that people really didn't know how to approach that patient with multiple traumas. And so this clinical guideline gives lovely algorithms. It's, whereas it is clinically orientated, it talks a lot about the organisation. So I think it's well worth our laboratory colleagues knowing about it. And the graphics in it are lovely. And then I think I see that the National Blood Transfusion Committee's website has had a little bit of a sort of a redo, which shows you each of the working groups, and it's the emergency planning working group that has put this together today. But there are some super documents there, including the emergency planning document for the transfusion teams that have been put together by people like Julie. So I would commend that people look at those two resources. I would ask you, Rachel, and the others to take a little look at chat and Q&A to see if there are any other questions that need answering. Fats, before I speak to the next slide, is there anything else you'd like to say to people about
Just
resources?
so the clinical guidelines for major incidents, you've got version 2. Version 3 is on its way. I'm not quite sure when it will be publicized, but it is being written as we speak. And also the EPRR document that you and I wrote on behalf of the Emergency Planning Working Group. This is again been revisited, given the pandemic and the changes in the IT that we've experienced, and the document needs a sort of a review with all these changes placed in. I've given you there the link to all the shortage plans. We're in pre-amber for O negative. We've got another bank holiday coming. It's going to put a strain on our stock. We've been in pre-amber for group A platelets since June 2022. And just after the last bank holiday, we were on the brink of going into amber. So just for people to be mindful, please use blood components appropriately. Remember PBM, and order just what you need, not more.
Thank you for that. Would you like to put up the next slide? This is bringing some bits and pieces from Sadie, and there is something around changing culture, and we can see people like Martin and others have been involved with changing the culture around the sort of organization. Something that Fats has almost indicated there, that actually people have sort of stopped giving blood, and I think all of us need to encourage society to play their part, not just in stopping the bleeding, but also being blood donors. And one of the things that Sadie teaches is around that a lot of what we do sits within a broader context. And so we've been learning about systems today, and you've been told what is going to happen, and there's nothing you can change there. But actually, she reminds us that actually there is some element of control that we have as individuals, and that's how we can take control over our work situations. And so I think the message I might leave you with, which Fats just highlighted there, is something from today. Just think about things that you've heard today, and whether you want to throw some things into chat or Q&A, just something that's sparked a light, that's reminded you maybe of something, it's revision, maybe it's something new, but what it is that you're going to take away from today and make that difference both for yourself and for your colleagues, because you're all busy people. You know, more than 100 of you have joined today, and we're very grateful to see you, and we hope that you can take everything you've learnt today forward. Thank you.